Okay, shall we start again? I think it's time for Konstantin's presentation. So, okay, we're starting a little bit late. You have 25 minutes and I will be sick.
Okay. So, what I'm going to talk about today is a kind of merger of two passions of mine. So at least from the high school, I was a history lover. And I even wanted to become a historian, archaeologist. And then one night before applying to the university, I decided, no, I better become economist because in such a way I will be able to earn more money. But still, I still love history and try to mix it into the other areas that I like rent control. So, I will start with some very basic things that all of you, of course, know, but I will need them during the presentation. So, we have in urban areas cycles of housing affordability or unaffordability. Typically, we approximate it using housing cost burden or rental burden if we're talking about tenant households. And the burden is affected by different factors. So you have three groups of factors that affect the numerator of it, like, for example, demand increase, positive demand shock resulting from immigration, or supply decline as a result of war, earthquake, or other natural catastrophe. So both of them lead to excess demand and rising rents. And we also have inflation shocks that lead to the overall change in the increase in the prices, including rental prices. And there's also one factor that affects the denominator here, the income, which is the economic crisis that leads to declining or decelerating nominal incomes. So all these things lead to increasing housing unaffordability. Given that in many cities the majority of population are tenants, this leads, of course, to massive protests of these tenants, and they sometimes are talking about market failure, so the market doesn't solve the problem of affordability, so they require the government to intervene and to do something. And that's what we observe, actually, in many cases, that the government really steps in and tries to alleviate the destiny of renters by using, for example, rent control. Of course, it's not the only measure, but it's one of the most prominent ones, at least in this presentation of mine. And many people think, even economists think, that rent control originated during World War I. Some even think that during World War II. Both are wrong. Both groups of people are wrong. Actually, it originated much earlier. It's not the truth that I discovered myself. You can find papers published in 1950 by Willis, by an American economist who wrote about this. But I wanted to dig even deeper. And I found quite a few examples of rent control all over at least Eurasia. So most of them in Europe, some in the Middle East, and some even in China, which does not necessarily mean that there were no other examples, because this list is far from being complete. And the history of rent control, as I said, is much older than 100 years. It's actually more than 2,000 years. So here we have time scale, and here we have different cities. So we start from Rome. So most of the time we'll be in Italy, by the way, including Turin. So we start in Rome, 48 before Christ. Julius Caesar, or whatever you call it in English, during Civil War, became the winner, and he, probably as a kind of sign of gratitude to the Roman citizens, he introduced rent control. So he actually last time we had a nice presentation, a year ago, a nice presentation about rent control in Rome in this workshop. Something similar was repeated 300 years later, and then 100 years later during or in Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople. In most of these cases, we have excess demand or positive demand shocks. Similarly, in Hangzhou, it's a nice middle-sized city, 5 million inhabitants now. Why Hangzhou? Because, there were many invasions from the north, from nomadic tribes invading China, and Chinese were very bad at defending themselves. They preferred to buy their freedom. So in one of these cases, they were defeated once again by one of these nomadic tribes, and the whole court, the emperor and all his people, thousands of people, had to move southwards, and they stopped in Hangzhou. So Hangzhou became the new capital, and of course immediately the population of the capital increased, and this led to excess demand, to increasing rents, and in fact the Chinese government introduced rent control, and by the way also social housing. So this probably was one of the first examples of social housing. Then you see lots of open books. What is this? These are the universities. You know that starting from the 12th century, a wave of founding universities began in Europe. So you have many universities in Oxford, well, in Oxford only one university, but in Cambridge, Paris, Salamanca, etc. One interesting thing related to these universities was that they had charter. So the Pope or the King or some local prince, they granted a charter to the university, which was a kind of code of conduct that defined the organization of the university. Among other things, it contained a provision on rent control. In particular, a commission, an arbitration commission formed by the participants of the university and those representatives from the city. They had to come together and identify a fair rent. So the rent to be paid by students and professors for the lodging. Yesterday, Sergio mentioned something that Spaniards wanted to introduce, but this attempt was failed. In case of the universities, the attempt was quite successful, at least in terms of replicating it, because it was like copy-paste from one charter to another. So it was spread in quite a few universities. Now you have these David stars, and this is another history, but pretty similar to universities. It's ghettos. You know, in medieval Europe, there were many ghettos. In Italy, the first one was introduced in Venice in 1515. And Jews were not allowed to own real estate, so they only could rent housing. And they were also confined to small quarters, to ghettos. Today in the morning I went to see what remains from Torino's Jewish ghetto, and it's quite interesting. And probably because the population there was growing while the housing stock remained unchanged, well, the rents increased because of this, and probably the government who introduced ghettos decided, okay, we do something, we confine them to ghettos, let's do something good for them, so let's fix the rents. Sometimes the rents were first increased by 1/3 and then fixed at this level. But anyway, they remained unchanged for centuries. In Rome, for example, it happened in the middle of 16th century, and they remained until the reunification until Rome became capital of the country. So almost 300 years long, the rents were frozen in these ghettos in Rome. One probably interesting, a bit piquant thing is this star. So guess what is this? not star, but the heart, of course. So this is another topic related to rent control. So it's prostitution, in fact. So in Sevilla, but not only in Sevilla, there were so-called mansebillas, prostíbulos, places where prostitutes lived and worked. And interestingly, you know that probably that Spanish kings were considered as very Catholic, and still they were tolerating prostitution. Why? Because it was a kind of wealth of escape for the population. So they didn't want to oppress too much the male part of the population, so they allowed for prostitution, but regulated it. So there were many regulations, including health checks, which is quite progressive for 16th century, and they also introduced rent control. So the prostitutes had to pay a fixed amount for their place of residence and work. So these are examples of positive demand shocks. And now I'd like to mention two cases of negative supply shocks. So one is here, it's Lisbon. So now we are still in Iberian Peninsula. Imagine we're on the 1st of November 1755. It's the All Saints' Day. Many people were gathered in churches, and then all of a sudden the earth started to tremble. The roofs crumbled down, killing hundreds and maybe thousands of people in the churches. Then fires started destroying housing. And then, if it wasn't enough, the huge wave came from the ocean. It was tsunami. So imagine tsunami. When we're talking about tsunami, we are thinking typically about Japan or Indonesia. In fact, there were quite a few examples of tsunami in Europe too. So that was a kind of constellation, very unfortunate constellation of facts. According to some estimates, 40% of housing stock was destroyed in Lisbon. Actually, today's Lisbon, I think, originated in the middle of 18th century mostly because of this catastrophe, and the government almost immediately introduced rent control. Another case is in France. It's Paris Commune. So it's 1870, 1871. The city was sieged, bombed, many houses were destroyed, and again, the government reacted by introducing rent control and also requisitioning of the housing. So that was the short, concise history of rent control. I could talk hours about this, but let me go quantitative. So this information, I think, is valuable in itself, but we are economists, we need always to measure something. So you can, in any case, you cannot publish anything like this in the economic journal, in some economic journals. So we have to be quantitative. What can we do? So one idea would be to look at the effects of rent control, but we lack data. There are no consistent and precise data for that period. Anyway, we already have lots of studies investigating effects of rent control for 20th, 21st century, so we already know more or less what are the effects of rent control. Now, the second thing that we could do, in principle, is to look at the determinants of rent control, why rent control is introduced at all. And that's the way I'm going to follow here. At least this is pretty much a work in progress, so I will be very glad to have your criticism. So we have some data on potential factors that could have contributed to the introduction of rent control. There are some caveats. Of course, the farther we are in the past, the lower the quality of the data, and the list, as I already mentioned, the list of the rent control episodes is not by no way complete. So each time I read something about history of rental housing in Europe, almost each time I come across a new episode of rent control. So that can be a problem. Let's look at the factors. So what I have here are different negative events So the black dots are rent control episodes. It doesn't mean that I consider them as a negative events. So pretty much what I consider as negative effects are wars. For example, these red areas, red polygons, are wars that took place in different countries. So here we have several European countries. And we see that in some of these countries, Spain, for example, Italy, Germany, and so on, people almost never stopped killing each other. So they were doing it on a regular basis. No single year passed without a war. So we can be very, very happy that we are in the 20th century, and not in 13th century. When people were tired of killing themselves, then epidemics came, and so viruses took over the work of killing people. And we have here some episodes. For example, this is the Black Death. This is the sweating disease. And there are many other episodes of epidemics. And you see that in some cases the rent control episodes coincide with wars and epidemics. And then we also have some large earthquakes. You see that Italy is the country that most suffered from earthquakes. These are the earthquakes with a magnitude of more than 6. And we see here Portugal, so this famous earthquake of 1755 and the rent control episode. Okay, that's nice, but that doesn't show us whether these events really explain the introduction of rent control or not. I mean, it's not nice that people had to suffer this, but it's nice that the picture is nice, I hope. So, what we can do, that's the simplest thing that came across my mind, is to to estimate a logit model using this data. So here we have as dependent variable, we have rent control dummy, which is equal to 1 in the year and country, in the year T and country I when rent control is introduced, and which is equal to 0 otherwise. So we have also a number of control variables, including wars, presence of Jews, epidemics, earthquakes, etc. And we have more than 2,000 cities in 43 countries and 600 years. So altogether we have a sample of more than 1 million observations, which is not bad for historical data, I think. Another question is how precise these data are, of course. So these are some preliminary results that I obtained from this data. So we see that none of these events, such as earthquake, epidemic, famine, temperature anomalies, and war, had increased the likelihood of introducing rent control. By contrast, the foundation of a university, the presence of a Jewish community, and the population size, not the population growth, but population size, increased the likelihood of introducing rent control. Also, I thought that introducing a dummy for Southern Europe, including countries such as Italy, Portugal, and Spain, could be interesting. And in fact, this dummy variable is statistically significant. So in these countries, rent control was much more widespread. And here we are coming to the last page of my study. So to summarize, what we can learn from these episodes of rent control, apart from what we just seen in the estimation results. So the regulations adopted at that time were very strict, so all of them could be classified as the first generation rent control. So these were rent freezes, in some cases even rent reductions. So for example in Rome, in the Jewish ghetto, rents once were reduced after a plague, after a big epidemic. Because well, the supply, I mean, there were less people than dwellings at that time, so it didn't make too much sense to keep the rent unchanged. As we say in Russia, the strictness of the laws is compensated by the tendency of people to not obey them. So in this case, the strictness of rent control is compensated by its very, very narrow application domains. It was applied to specific cities or even neighborhoods. So the Turin's ghetto is very small. You can, in 5 minutes, you can go around the whole ghetto. And to specific population groups. So to clergy, to Jews, to pilgrims, to prostitutes, and to scholars. But the time of application was very heterogeneous. So in some cases it was just 1 year, like in Rome. Well, we don't really know because we just have the information about the introduction of rent control, but we don't have information about its continuation. But in some cases, like in already mentioned ghetto in Rome, we had the duration of 3 centuries. I didn't mention the case of Madrid, although it's also very interesting. In Madrid, by the way, and most of Spaniards do not know this. Once I was in Bilbao in February, I think, and a journalist came to me and asked me about rent control, and when I told that, you know, that rent control in Spain has a very long history. Already in the 16th century, in Madrid you had rent control, and it lasted until 1842, so almost 300 years. The journalist was amazed. What? She thought it was something very, very new, like rent control introduced in Catalonia in 2019. Not 19, but 21. So, and yeah. But in some cases we see that these regulations were very, very long. So, I think that's quite an interesting topic to be investigated further, and I will be delighted to, if you will have some kind of comments, even critiques. So here I'm stopping, and I'm welcoming you to give some feedback if you have some. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting to me. One thing that I haven't understood is that you showed us this really nice graphic with all the wars and the epidemics, and it seems that after like wars and big plagues, there was like a point that was a rent control laws or measure. But then after that you showed the data about how wars and epidemics actually did not affect an increase in rent control measures. So do you think like war and epidemics are related to rent control measure not in terms of increasing but in terms of frequency? I didn't understand which is the relation at the end between these events and rent control, in your opinion. Thank you.
I didn't understand the last word. I mean, not the last word, but didn't affect rent control in terms of?
Frequency.
Frequency, yeah. Well, one explanation, I have no ready explanation. I thought about this. One explanation would be that people during wars, they were tired. I mean, they had enough things to do than to introducing rent control. Although you find some examples of introducing rent control during, for example, 100 Years' War in France. Maybe the better explanation is that they were so frequent compared to rent control episodes that regardless of whether you are always in the war. So sometimes you have rent control, sometimes you don't have, but you always have war. It's like a constant in your life. And therefore, here I don't find any effect.
And I have also a second question, if I can. And why rent control measures are more like frequent or more, takes more place like in Southern Europe? It's for historical reason in your idea, or?
You know, the archaeologists say if you want to find something, you better look, or if you lost something, you better look in the place where you have the light post.
Okay.
Not in the places where it's dark, and it makes sense. So maybe in those countries the bureaucracy was better developed, so we have more information about the legal acts. This can be one explanation. Or maybe the urbanization rate was much higher in Italy and Spain at that time than in, for example, Northern Europe, and therefore they also had more frequently this kind of problem.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Welcome.
Yes, I'm not sure whether it's not there. I think it's you don't estimate the right model for measuring it.
Okay.
I think you should have two ideas. One could be a hazard model, proportional hazard model, right?
Proportional hazard model.
I think that may, in some way, so that the waiting period, kind of, when an event happens, that this is reduced for the next rent control, right? Or you can also try to go more for the intensity of what is happening before, and it's just the only thing you want to have. It doesn't have to immediately, but is like in the time before more intense events in comparison to the average or something like that. So I think if you do there a bit more fine-tuning, I mean, it looks like that it's there actually. I think it's rather that this model is too plain, and maybe also not everything at the same time. Then you can also have a kind of a horse race, what is more important. But like really, when you also play with the intensity and strictly kind of require that it has to be before an event and then after, but not directly adding it as a control. Also, so really the timely thing has to be fulfilled. I think then you actually see it in the model, to be honest, because it really looks like that from this graph.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Thank you for this presentation. I mean, eyeballing the chart, it looks like there's a relationship between wars and controls. The interesting question would be why some countries introduce rent controls during wars and others do not. Now, what's behind this? Are they like institutions, cultures? Does it make a difference whether one country perhaps is invading the other?
Well, I don't find too many cases of rent control related to war. So typically it was related to positive demand shock, not negative supply shock. So even during the war, for example, during 100 years war in France, there was a king. At that time he was not considered as a king. Actually, the English king was considered the king of France at the same time. So the Dauphin, the heir who would become the king of France, he had to flee from Paris because Paris sublevated, I don't know what's raised against him, and so he had to leave from his former capital and go to Poitiers. It was during the war and due to the war, but the shock was positive demand shock, so increase in the population. And it led to introduction of rent control. So in most cases you have rent control as a result of positive demand shock. Like in Malta, for example, you have knights arriving from Rhodes who increased the population of the country, demand for housing stock, and therefore also this led to introduction of rent control. But the rent control introduction related to destruction in the housing stock is much more rare event. Maybe that's the explanation why we don't find some, maybe the misspecification, or maybe the mere fact that wars didn't have a direct effect on introduction of rent control, maybe only indirect one.
And do you make a difference between the country that is invading and the country that is invaded?
No, I don't do it, because in the data, I don't find this. There's a data set a nice data set on wars. Of course, I didn't compile all this data myself, so this is based on the economic and overall political history research done before me. So all of these indicators, and this war indicator or this war database doesn't contain, as far as I know, the variable who is invading and who is defending.
I would assume that the invaded country would suffer more devastation in its housing stock. And so perhaps in the aftermath of the war, they might introduce some forms of rent controls.
Yeah, but I don't find these examples in the data. Maybe because not because they do not exist, but because it's still not found.
When I just think back about the paper we wrote on St. Petersburg, which is First World War, but a city that was not part of the war zone, but actually a city where people were fleeing to, and then that city introduced rent control because so many refugees were coming to. And I mean, we saw that now in Poland, actually, because there's even a paper about it, actually. So a lot of people were coming to Polish cities, so Krakow and Warsaw, their rental markets were exploding, right? So it's not the war zone that is affected, but usually the ones around where people are fleeing to. So in that sense, maybe if you look at neighboring cities, I don't know, right? So that would be makes more sense, because why should be rent control in the war zone directly?
Yeah, that's just point. I mean, you find after February 22, you find actually rent increases in many former Soviet republics, in Tashkent, Tbilisi, even in Belgrade. You have rent increases due to refugees or people coming, fleeing from Russia. We see this example in Hangzhou, in China, for example, in Song Dynasty, China. But again, I don't find so much evidence about this in terms of the episodes of rent control. So typically, the motivation is related to the population increase, whether it's because of the administrative move of the capital, or due to invasion that led to exactly what you just described, led to people fleeing to some other place, and in that place we have rent increases and overall price increases. Of course, not only rents increased at that time. Well, thank you very much. I think we have to continue with our schedule. And now it's turn of Aurora.
Okay, thank you very much. In this 20-25 minutes, I'm going to present something that is not economics and that is related to my study on the role of Italian trade unions in supporting rent control in Italy in the early 1970s. So a little bit of context. After World War II, the Italian rental market was always partially controlled until 1978, when a fair rent system was introduced, the equo canone. If we focus on this period from the end of World War II to 1978, we can identify two different phases. From 1947, when there is a big rent control laws, to 1969, The market is partially controlled by different rent freezes, but there is a tendency towards liberalization. At the level of the political debate, there is an ongoing talk of a future and a very close liberalization of the market. And also, during this period, the share of controlled units is decreasing. In 1967, a law promising a complete liberalization of the market was issued, and this complete liberalization was supposed to arrive just 2 years later. Instead, in 1969, this tendency towards liberalization was completely interrupted and replaced with a tendency towards the strengthening of rent control. The frequency of rent freezes increased, and at the political level, there was no talk of liberalization anymore. Everyone was talking about implementing and increasing, rent control, up to the establishment of the rent system. I already emphasized elsewhere that this shift might be connected mainly to the inflation rate. In the 70s, there is a surge in the inflation level in Italy. So I think there is this kind of explanation, but here I want to focus on the political role that trade unions played in supporting rent control. Of course, 1969 is also an important year in Italian social history. We remember it in Italian as the autumn of 1969 is called the autunno caldo, the hot autumn, because there was a peak in social conflict, especially in the factories, and there was also a big struggle for housing. So the social conflict went out of factories and extended to the struggle for housing, especially in the biggest cities, for example in Turin, but on the whole national territory. New forms of struggle for housing were experienced for the Italian praxis: rent self-reduction, rent strikes, opposition to evictions, and a tenants' trade union spontaneously emerged, and then it was finally officially created in 1972. But I don't want to focus on this, on the struggle for housing and on the tenants' trade unions. I want to focus on the action played by general trade unions, not in support of tenants, but as a part of a general economic policy design. In Italy, we have, and we had at the time, 3 main confederations of labor, which were born related to 3 reference parties. So we had the CGL, which was related to the Italian Communist Party, the CISL, related to the Christian Democracy, and the WIL, related to the Italian Socialist Party. Of course, the relationship between trade unions and political parties was complicated, and it varied. The relationship was tighter or loosened over time. And in 1969 was, of course, also a very important year for trade unions. Because of the social conflicts in the factories, unions became stronger and stronger. But not only this, there was a strong push from below for the formation of a unitary union, from factories and from union categories. And so after 1969, the 3 confederations became getting closer and closer, until in 1972 a federation between the 3 trade unions, Federazione, CGL, CISL and WIL, was born. There was never a unitary trade union in Italy, but this federation was the closest point. And in the meantime, as a result of this process, trade unions experienced more and more autonomy from their reference parties. They started acting as quasi-independent political actors, so in a unitary way and with an independent program. And what's interesting for us is that they started acting beyond labor issues. They did not focus only on labor issues anymore, but in 1970 they drew up a program of reforms, and they thought of this program of reforms as a part of a new economic policy model that they intended to propose. They called this the New Development Model. The central points in the reform were housing, healthcare, transportation, and taxation. So, of course, in many countries, trade unions advanced political reforms, but in Italy the case is a little bit particular because in the same period the parties were a little weaker than the trade unions. So trade unions actually wanted to substitute the parties in this struggle for reforms. With regard specifically to rent control, they asked for a 3 years minimum extension of existing rent freezes, and most importantly, they wanted the government to take the first steps to a fair rent system. This demand platform was sent directly to the government. In spring and autumn 1970, there were direct meetings between the trade unions and the government to discuss this reform platform. And of course, the strength of the trade unions came from the workers, so many general strikes for reforms were organized to support this demand platform. They had this immediate success, like in October, as a result of these meetings, a 3-year extension of rent freezes was issued. And trade unions became key interlocutors in the path to fair rent. So this story goes on until 1978, and I'm studying the role of trade unions in all this process. But here I want to skip this part. I'm stopping in 1970, 1971, just to underline something. Trade unions did not present this program of reforms only or mainly as an answer to social needs. It's not, we want the housing reform because tenants need better housing. They presented this program of reforms as a part of this new model for development, of this economic policy model. And they claimed that a new model for development was needed in Italy because the old model for development had stopped working. And what was this old model for development? The trade unions are plainly explicit in this. So as you might know, between the end of the 50s and the beginning of the 60s, Italy experienced the so-called economic miracle, a period of great growth. The GDP level grew at a pace of 6–8% per year. And this growth was mainly due to the exportation of Italian goods, of Italian commodities. And Italy was competitive on the international market because of low wages, mainly. But in the 60s, this model, you can't see the arrows. I don't know why. There are some arrows where you see the big space. However. So in the 60s, the conditions for these very low wages in Italy changed. There were some changes in the labor market. There was full employment was reached in the north, increased contractual strength of industrial workers, and so there were some waves of struggles in 1963 and 1969. And so the market experienced proper wage shocks, and the exportations were affected by this increase in the wage level. So trade unions said, we should replace this failing model, this export-led model, which is not working anymore because wages are increasing, with an economic model based on expanding domestic demand. We have to to support internal demand. It's a Keynesian reasoning. And this will sustain industrial production. So this is what trade unions said, and I quote here from a document which we have in our archive, a joint document of the 3 trade unions, a resumption of development that is fundamentally based, as has been the case in the past, on sustained foreign demand and consequently on exports is extremely unlikely. The need to give greater impetus to the productive activities of consumer goods and services requires the invigoration of domestic consumer demand. So the reforms are thought and presented as the key measures to sustain internal demand. To create and sustain internal demand, you need public investment, especially in the South, the trade union said, to achieve full employment. So the reforms would act as a stimulus for public investment, because the reform of housing would lead to public housing construction, and this would create occupation. Healthcare construction, transportation, okay, the same. But also reforms must be thought as a way to cut the workers' cost of living on housing, on healthcare, on transportation. So how can you cut the workers' cost of living without affecting the industrial system? So without increasing wages too much, you cut other voices in the cost of living. So how can you do that? Through a good welfare system, housing welfare, healthcare, national healthcare, and so on. And then the other elements of this recipe that the trade unions proposed was this war on unproductive rents. We don't need to attack profits. We need to attack unproductive rents not in the sense of urban rents, but in the sense of this like classical economic sense of income going to unproductive activities. So we will attack urban rent, fiscal rent, commercial rent. And this way, let's say, we will move from a class structure against a class struggle against profits. So in 1969, the factory struggle was centered on the bargaining for higher wages, and so there was in trade unions documents class rhetoric, Marxist economic lexicon. But from the very next year, trade unions do not attack profits anymore. This is another quotation from a document that we have in the archive. The goal is fighting rent positions, eliminating speculation, waste, and exorbitant profit on essential human goods such as housing and health. And so class rhetoric remains in factory documents, but in general documents, there is a Keynesian economics lexicon. And what is very interesting is that in the same period, the Employers Association, the main Employers Association in Italy, had exactly the same positions. In March 1969, so before the hot autumn, the Employers Association, Confindustria, created this committee, Commissione Pirelli. It is a committee which had it was supposed to create a proposal for a new political line for the Employers Association. And the biggest names in Italian private industry of the time, Pirelli, Agnelli, the owner of Fiat, Cicogna, Olivetti, these are big industrialists, private industrialists in Italian history. They were part of this Commissione Pirelli. And in February 1970, so 1 month before the trade unions presented their program of reforms, they published this Pirelli report, which was very famous at the time. The Pirelli report called for a collaboration of all social forces for a new development model based on the expansion of internal demand. The key points of the Pirelli report was that Italy needed full employment, investment in southern Italy, collaboration with trade unions within the limits of productivity constraints, so without increasing wages too much, and reforms. And here I quote from the report, as far as income redistribution is concerned, private entrepreneurs are convinced that there is ample opportunity for agreement with all trade union organizations. It is in the common interest to overcome situations that burden workers, consumers, service recipients, and production costs. Referring to the welfare and social security system and the tax system is immediate. And then the document continues, it is possible to indicate as a matter of desirable collaboration the problems concerning employment policy, social security and social assistance, housing, transport, and land issues. Then, actually, this is the Pirelli report, but the Employers Association was internally very divided on this topic because there were some industrialists which had an interest in the increase in internal demand, and others who did not the state to expand public expenditures. And then after the 1971 currency crisis and in 1973 energy crisis, this reformist front weakens, and the focus of Confindustria is on attacking trade unions, demand for the containment of wages and of factory conflicts. So there were some meetings between trade unions and Confindustria in December 1971 on reforms, including on rent control, but they were not as successful as they would have been just 1 year earlier. And the 70s was still a year of reforms, but things were changing. I think I almost finished my time, but my presentation has talked, I have talked not so much about housing, not so much about rent control. The intention was to show that rent control was a key ingredient in this policy program, but it was an ingredient because in a way that is related to housing problems. It's an ingredient in a way that is related to general economic problems. In this case, the idea was we will relaunch Italian industrial production by cutting on unproductive voices in the cost of living of workers. And so we will have these reforms to benefit all the Italian productive system, and that's what also industrialists thought. So this can be an element when discussing why rent control is still implemented despite the evident drawbacks in the housing market. So thank you for your attention.
I just wanted to comment on this interesting motivation of rent control, so as a way to reduce production costs. Because I find a similar example in Germany in the 20s, where there was the same argument. So it wasn't, well, on the one hand, there was a social argument, we need to protect tenants, but on the other hand, there was equally powerful argument, we need to increase our competitivity. So since housing costs make up maybe 20-25% of the total cost of living, when we reduced it, we can also reduce the wage demands of the workers and therefore the wage component of the costs. And it seems that this argument was used not only in Germany, but at least also in Italy and maybe in other countries.
Yeah, exactly. And also welfare systems, I think we should start also seeing them not only as of course an answer to needs, but they were fitting certain interests to lower production costs. Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering if you also had access to, for example, landlord lobbies and counter-arguments that focus on this general or broader argument in that period, or?
No, I haven't had a chance to look at landlords association in this period, because I should do that, because for now I wanted to move further from the landlords versus tenants discourse, political discourse. So yeah, for now it was like, okay, let's not look for a conflict between landlords and tenants, because there is, of course, but there are also other directions of these conflicts around rents. But it would be interesting to do that. Thank you.
Can I answer? Yeah, because I'm looking at the 1920s in Geneva, and I found documents of the general, I don't know, lobby of business lobby, let's say, and there is internal dissensions between landowners and industrials about rent control, where they fight because there was also a similar argument. So maybe.
And so the industrialists were supporting it?
Yes, sorry.
Oh, very interesting.
But landlords are...
And landlords were, that would be a nice comparison.
This, because this reminds me of Brazil, the case of Brazil in the 1930s. There, what they wanted to do, most of the capital was invested in real estate, and the government wanted to industrialize the country. So they introduced rent control with the purpose of divesting capital from real estate, so that the people had no other choice than to invest in the industry. And it's very similar to this Swiss example.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we have the last presentation of this session and of the workshop. I hope Alexander is online and can share with us his, he's online. So, please.
Oh.
Yeah, you have to switch on your...
No, it's functioning.
Yes.
You hear me? Okay. So, Konstantin and Aurora have already excused our panel for being too much focused on history, and I apologize for being a historian. Let me open my presentation. So my presentation delves into history of implementation of the first generation of rent control, and for most part, it is dedicated to negative or unintended outcomes of these policies, those that echo even in the nowadays, when whatever refers to rent controls is somehow equal to the first generation negative outcomes of the rent control. So the title of my presentation is as shown, statism, petty corruption and clientelism, housing rent control in European semi-periphery, 1918-1924, where European semi-periphery refers to Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia. So these are the basic units of research. So now I will provide you with the structure of the presentation. So I will begin by providing a context of state intervention, which will include the intensity of policies applied, then the degree of rent depreciation, and the pecuniary situation of civil servants in these three countries. The next, I will outline the institutional schemes established with aim to intervene in housing relations and also to carry out requisitioning procedures. And at the end, then of course I will provide you with outline of the applied policies and this interplay between statism, corruption, and clientelism. And at the end, we will come up to conclusions and final remarks. And I will try also to conceptualize a bit this issue with the conceptions of Mundo Piago theoretical framework. So to start with this context, with this contextualization of situation in these three countries, they relate to this Southeast and East Central European pattern of the housing policy. You can see that this is a kind of developmental typology. 1 to 6 degrees of intensity. Degree 6 refers to confiscation or nationalization, and it was recorded only in the Soviet Union and during the Bolshevik Revolution in Hungary in 1919. And the point 1 refers to the laissez-faire regime of the free market situation. So what we can see for this period that we will be dealing with between 1918 and 1924, you can see that our region, Southeast Europe and East Central Europe, represent quite a high intensity of the applied policies. On the other hand, if we take into account the what I considered as a residual buying power of pre-war rent. So when you compare controlled rent index with the living cost index in interwar period, and when you compare it with the standard of the pre-war buying power of rent, then you can see also for our countries like Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, that it was actually that it went to be between 8 or 11%, in Yugoslavia around 20%, in Czechoslovakia a bit better due to better monetary situation in Czechoslovakia, around 30% of buying power. So we could see that also in terms of the pecuniary situation of the landlords, it was quite a high degree of the intensity of the policy applied. Then, as we are dealing here with administrative offenses and with cases of corruption, malpractices in the implementation of this policy by civil servants, by the state employees, I tried here to compare again the pecuniary situation of civil servants compared to the living costs indices of the living cost, but also compared to their relative status in society when compared, for instance, with the workers' incomes. So you could see that in Bulgaria and Yugoslavia, the income of the civil servants was lagging very much behind the standards they enjoyed before the war, but also when compared with the workers who managed to obtain with this trade union movement and with this huge wave of strikes throughout the region, they managed to bargain for their salaries. In Czechoslovakia, the situation was actually much better in both terms. So when compared to their pre-war standards, and also when compared with how workers were compensated for their labor, and in these terms, we come up to this very context that we have the high intensity of the housing policy applied in the region. But also we have quite a different situation between these two Balkan countries, Yugoslavia and Bulgaria, in terms of how the civil servants were paid when compared with Czechoslovakia. So in terms of this basic human infrastructure that was in charge of actually implementing this policy, this might be of some interest. So we have ad hoc housing authorities. I placed this ad hoc between brackets, because it happened that this emergency period lasted for quite a long, almost throughout the interwar period. So one would ask whether these housing commissions and committees, authorities, whether they were actually only provisionary authorities or they actually represented a kind of stable institutional formation. So we have a different approach. We have these tripartite commissions in Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia, where you find the equal representations of confronted parties. So the organizations of the landlords and the tenants, they would delegate their representatives, but you also had the state appointed president. So this was the way how the state managed to intervene into this social and this almost this conflict on a level of this organized parties, but it was also a conflict almost on the level of the class clash in between tenants and landlords. On the other hand, in Bulgaria, there was a one-party commissions. They didn't allow for the tenants to have representation because the agrarian government in Bulgaria was in a serious conflict with them, and they did not want to allow, as they would say, the Bolshevik representation in this tripartite commission. So this was a kind of a partisan commissions in Bulgaria, which became notorious for the corruption. While this tripartite principle in Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia was compromised by its structure, namely the one, the official delegated by state was usually tenant himself, or somehow related to this overall tenant interests. So often it ended up that it was 2 against 1 in these tripartite councils, commissions, courts, and so on. While in Bulgaria, it happened, and recall the previous slide showing the pecuniary situation with the salaries of the Bulgarian civil servants. It happened that actually the most of the state intervention on the ground actually ended up into huge abuse of power and almost an everyday instances of those corruption affairs and the overall system of racketeering of the landlords. So this is what I framed as a Yugoslav and Bulgarian patterns of racketeering, then staged requisitions also for the purpose of racketeering landlords, and also a kind of perverted reverse clientelism that you find in these countries. So what was going on the ground is that the landlords were asked informal payments. They were asked bribes. Actually, in Austria, in this period, there wasn't possibility for some luxurious apartments when the owner wanted to exempt himself from the application of the requisitioning measure. He could provide a payment, but formal payment in terms of he could do it in the full capacity of what was required by the law. Here they managed to find another way, of course, in terms of informal payments in order to exempt themselves from requisitioning. From my research, it seems to me that this was the dominant pattern in Bulgaria, while it was also present in Yugoslavia. What one finds also is that on the other part, the would-be tenants, so those who were seeking for the apartments, they were also asked bribes in order to obtain access to housing. So they would report themselves, or they would go to the housing authorities, and then they would be asked bribes in order to be provided by the housing. There was also one scheme of requisitioning of the newly constructed flats in Yugoslavia, but also this happened in Bulgaria. So these new flats, they were exempted from rent control. They were not part of the housing rent control. And the governments did it because they wanted somehow to stimulate the new constructions. But what these guys were doing is actually that they would have the person of their own personal trust. So the civil servants and the members of these ad hoc authorities, they would have a person who would enter this regular market agreement of the leasing apartment. And then they would wait for 1 or 2 months. And afterwards, they would requisition that very apartment, and they would impose this rent control system, which provided for, let's say, 3 or 4 or 5 times less of rent income for the owner. And in one provincial Bosnian town, I found a case of not less than 6 consecutive transactions of the very same tenant or would-be tenant in coordination with the local housing authorities. He was renting one apartment after another, and they were actually doing the same scheme of requisitioning it and providing it to another, then quite a complicated scheme of the subtenants that were also paying some sort of the bribes to the protected tenants. So all these abuses of the system were initiated by the underpaid officials in charge of these affairs. So I have here a kind of picturesque representation of what was going on in reality, and this is also a kind of this is also I didn't tell you about this perverted, this reversed political clientelism. When clients are actually supplying their patrons with requisitioned housing in Yugoslavia and Bulgaria, because under regular conditions, it is the patron. So throughout history, from feudal times to nowadays with the political clientelism, it is expected to have a scheme where the patron is actually distributing some public goods to the clients, and not vice versa. And this is actually the example of how it happened within the Yugoslav Ministry of Social Policy, where this guy, Miloslav Stojadinovic, he was the chief of the housing department, but he was also the protected tenant. He enjoyed the status of the protected tenant within the system of the legislation and the policy guided by his own department. And he was actually lodging the apartment in the very downtown. It's a luxurious 5-room apartment. He didn't even pay he didn't even pay bills for the electricity and water, and he was sued by the landlady, and now he's entering this housing court, where the guys who are supposed to make a decision in his case are in administrative and in political terms, they are his subordinates from the ministry and from his own radical party. So we have here this picturesque this picturesque description of how it looked like. So when Stojadinovic appeared in the room where the trial would take place, the president of the court, so the guy who was actually subordinate to him, greeted him in a servile manner, grasped his hand, and licked his own lips as if he were a male cat. The president offers him a chair, and they have a lovely chat. Then the president of the housing authority came, and he also greeted Stojadinovic with awe and gave him a chair next to him, and then they whispered confidentially into each other's ears. The judge representing tenants stretched his lips wide in trying to appear nice and servile. This was taken from the landlord's organ, the organ representing interest of the organized landlords. The title of the article is Mafia in the capital town, referring to Stojadinovic. So we have another case of a would-be tenant, Dmitry Liev, who was a high-ranked party official of Bulgarian Agrarian Union, and he was trying to obtain suitable accommodation from housing authorities in Sofia. And this is what he was told by the president of the housing authorities in charge of this business, when he tried somehow to warn him that he will tell to his superiors that he is asking for bribes. And he answered him, "You may remove me from the post, but anyway, I will not find you a room without a bribe." And then the guy, this Dmitry, is explaining that he turned to another president of the housing authorities, but he also did not accomplish anything. And then he made a full circle all throughout the Bulgarian capital city, and everywhere he couldn't find anything without a bribe. And at the end, he said, "Meanwhile, I learned meanwhile, he learned that the first guy, the president, who was quite that he was quite confident about his position. He learned that he was appointed a housing inspector, so that he was actually promoted afterwards. So on the other hand, so we had a Yugoslav and Bulgarian case, and throughout many cases and the sources I went through, and actually I published a book dealing with these issues. It was last month that it was published in Serbian. So this is based on a huge research, which provided me ground to claim actually this widespread corruption attitudes of housing, of ad hoc housing authorities in Bulgaria and Yugoslavia. On the other hand, in Czechoslovakian case, I find only, throughout my research, I found only several cases of the administrative offenses and corruption. But also I find this staunch attitude by almost everybody in this political and social environment that this housing policy was that it was based on the pattern of favoritism. And it may be explained by this socialist and social democratic parties that were all the time, they were component of the coalition governments in Czechoslovakia. So we have landlords who complain about this favoritism. We also have even the communists, and they were the opposition party, but they also praised these housing authorities for being righteous in making decisions. But when you enter into this let's say analysis of the narratives of the arguments by the Landlords Association, you see that they complain more against the housing regulation themselves than against those ad hoc housing authorities. And of course, the remaining question is whether we can speak about favoritism when we are actually referring to implementation of the regulation that is entitled that these were the laws on the tenant protection. So to come up to conclusions and the final remarks. So what comes out of my research is that the corruption, the favoritism, clientelism, including this perverted case of the, let's say, reversed clientelism in Bulgaria and Yugoslavia, that all these anomalies were less likely to occur when the state personnel in charge of running these institutions were better paid, and vice versa. And also that housing arbitration became more impartial when transferred to the competence of regular courts than when it was going on within the framework of these ad hoc or provisional institutions. Also, although I don't like entering this mental mapping or trying to provide some cultural explanation of, let's say, providing this huge gap in between what might be considered the Balkan culture of informal payments and this endemic corruption and so on, and on the other hand, this Central European attitude of situation that was much more based on the legality and on the formal procedures. But I found this Munju Pipidi's cultural reference as acceptable. Because she placed this differentiation between particularist culture of privileges in these Balkan societies and this universalistic societies that we could find the Czechoslovakian pattern quite suitable. I find it acceptable in terms of what is the concept lying actually behind this distribution of public resources, whether there is this universalistic attitude based on the legal frameworks, or whether it is still this particularist culture of privileges with all these schemes of the partisan, clientelists, of the corruptionists, pyramids of influence, of networks, and so on, dominating public sphere in Bulgaria and Yugoslavia. So somehow I try to escape this mental mapping, but at the end, some let's say bits and pieces of these mental structures and this cultural context was inevitable. But at least in terms of my research, I tried also to formulate it and to base it on quite on a quite elaborated and technical terms based on all those data on the income and the level of the level of accountability of the human structures based on the level of income when it comes to civil servants. So thank you so much for attention. I hope you could hear me. That was my presentation.
And I think it's all very fascinating what you do. My question is related to your sources. So what sources did you use? How did you limit your sources? That's one thing. And my other question is related to your case studies, because I guess that you studied cities, and these cities can have very different practices. I have the impression, I don't know, based on your earlier work, that you studied Košice in Slovakia, right? And like that city might be very different from some other cities, because in Košice there was this large Hungarian-speaking population at the time, German-speaking, and a lot of Czech officials were actually sent there and settled there, and I'm just wondering that perhaps this like lack of favoritism doesn't have to do with the fact that, you know, like officials deciding about requisitioning perhaps were not embedded that much in local society. That's just a hint. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. Actually, not in Košice, but throughout Czechoslovakia, I found this problem regarding the requisitioning, especially in what was later known or what became notorious as Sudetenland. So the regions populated by Germans, ethnic Germans, where they obtained authority on the local level. So I found some internal memos of the Czechoslovak authorities. Why? For instance, some state officials or some state services could not function, like the postal personnel. For them, you were supposed to provide some kind of the accommodation, and you could not provide accommodation without requisitioning. And for requisitioning, you at the first drafts and the contents of the legislation, it was done on the local level, and then you could not provide it because actually sending this ethnic Czech into the German environment was a part of the arranging for the functioning of the postal services, but it was also a part of the policy. to somehow try to ethnicize this region by sending their ethnic Czech or Slovak officials. So on the part of these local authorities, there was the level of mistrust that they did not want actually to provide for this requisitioning practices. So then they changed the legislation. They made some amendments in order to provide some higher level of the authorities to impose the decision for the requisitioning. And when it comes to the sources, actually, you know, also in my previous research, and this is where I followed your lead in terms of trying to reconstruct completely this basic institutional, this legal framework of. So whatever of the legal sources that I could find, I use it to make this institutional framework. Then I had the newspapers, the organs of the tenants and the landlords organization, often completely, of course, confronted. Often, of course, dubious in terms of to what extent I can actually accept these bias statements. And then all the time I was trying to go through the official statistics and also through these legal sources in order to check and to confirm what they claim was actually the actual, for instance, income they were receiving, or the situation on the internal market, and so on. Then, in Czechoslovak case, I had plenty of the archival sources, which was not always the case in Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and Poland. I did also research on Poland. So at the end, somehow, I relied mostly in this book, actually. No, it is quite blurred. You cannot see the design. So I relied on the legal sources. I relied on the accounts from these interest group newspapers. I relied on the newspapers. I relied on the party organs, of the socialist, of the Demo-Christian, of the so conservative, then centrist, leftist, communist. Then accounts of the local experts from Poland, from Czechoslovakia, from Yugoslavia, and I tried somehow to come up to some conclusions that might be justified, and I'm ready to. I stand behind my conclusions.
I would like also to make a comment on these arbitration councils or commissions, whatever they are. So these commissions with representatives of both landlords, tenants, sometimes also state. And it's interesting to notice, I think interesting, that they originated in quite a few countries, at least in Europe. So almost any country you take, UK, Italy, Russia, in the late 10th, 20th years, they all had arbitration councils in the beginning, but then pretty quickly they were abolished. So probably they experienced the same problem of corruption, they were not efficient, and then finally their function was given to the courts. In New York, for example, in 1919, I think they started already from the courts, so it didn't occur to them to organize any arbitration council. But in European countries, they were widespread initially, and then pretty quickly disappeared.
But you know, somehow these arbitration committees were corresponding to completely similar situation that existed in Germany, in Austria, as with different names on the level of the huge industry, on the regional level, on the factory level. This was the moment of the height of the influence of the social democracy throughout Central Europe. It happened also in France. Charles Mayer wrote this beautiful book about recasting bourgeois Europe. And he explained this very structure, and it was the same. It was the equal representation of the employers and employees, and the state-appointed president of this council, and whatever they were called, different names throughout the West. In Europe, and to some extent it was a kind of counterpart of the Bolshevik Soviets, of the one-party representation of the left, which was imposed later by Bolsheviks, and before by these leftist fractions of the left in Russia. But social democratic, let's say, counterpart of this institution is what we find with arbitration councils. And one of the conclusions by Charles Mayer is that actually these arbitration committees, not only in housing domain, but also in the domain of huge industry and the local industry, and even on the level of the individual enterprises, that they contributed to pacification of Europe. And they were also dissolved by beginning of 1920s, let's say 1922, 1923. They have already lost their momentum. No matter that in Weimar Constitution, for instance, they were foreseen as a kind of institutional ground for providing this harmonizations between the conflicted interests between the employers and employees.
Very interesting. Thanks a lot. And I don't see further questions. I'd like to talk to you, but maybe we'll do it sometime in the future. So here we have the end of our presentation part, and now we can see what are the results of this survey. Yeah.
Okay, probably we didn't gather suggestions yeah, zero. We can do it informally if you don't want to pass through the QR code. And you did? Oh, that's bad news. Can you try again?
Say we have 10 different